it's Starzy, and today I am going to be talking through 5 queer books that I recommend. This is something that I would actually like to do kind of semi-regularly, maybe monthly, where I have some kind of theme or category and I give you 5 recommendations to do with that. And so if you have any suggestions for that, please do leave them down below. But I thought that queer reads would be a good place to start since we are in Pride Month. With everything going on at the moment, it also feels important to state that we respect all members of the queer community here, no matter how you identify, and that also goes for race, because the racism that exists throughout the world and has always, it's awful and things do need to change. And these issues are worldwide, so I know the US is getting a lot of attention right now, but I think everyone needs to be educating themselves and looking at their own countries too. I mean, where I am in Australia, as we know, it was kind of built on racism, and there are still a lot of issues going on. So I hope that everyone is educating themselves and doing what they can, and that we also do not need to be giving attention to trash. We don't need to be giving any more attention or energy to trash authors at this point, because even calling them out is still giving them attention. Even, how's it go? Even bad publicity is still good publicity. I don't remember how that phrase goes, but you're still giving them publicity by specifically mentioning them and everything that's going on. And the world is making me very angry right now, but basically, we appreciate all people here, all members of the queer community, all people, regardless of race. Black Lives Matter, things need to change, all of that. With that out of the way, we're going to talk about 5 queer books, 5 rainbow reads. And I do need to mention that a number of these are kind of skewed towards sapphic representation, since that is what I personally connect to most, but there are some other things in here. But yeah, just know that this is a list that was curated by a bisexual woman, so that does have an influence on what is collected here. And that feels really weird to say out loud, because I only officially came out like 2 years ago, and I'm 27. Whew. I'm just having a moment. Right, let's carry on. And it's still not something I necessarily announce in my day-to-day, so if anyone from my real life stumbles across this video and you didn't know, now you do, I guess. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna start with today is actually a non-fiction book that I think that really is the kind of thing that's useful for anyone and everyone to read, whether you're part of the queer community or not. And that is the ABCs of LGBT+ by Ashley Mardell. And this is basically like an encyclopedia of queer terminology. So, and it also goes through kind of some of the reasoning behind why people identify in certain ways and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it's really useful if you're not part of the queer community to read this, so that you know all the terminology that's used and you have a bit more understanding of other people and why they are certain ways, or why they identify in certain ways, and also a lot of people often expect their education from people from certain communities. Like, I know it's been happening a lot at the moment with people constantly asking the Black community for things like book recommendations and stuff like that. And it happens a lot in the queer community, where if someone doesn't understand a term, they're constantly asking, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean? And if you read something like this, then you're doing the right thing, putting the responsibility on you to take your own responsibility for your learning. So I also, though, think that this book is very useful for people who are queer. I mean, there are a few terms in here that even I wasn't previously familiar with. Obviously, you've got your things that everyone kind of knows, like gay, lesbian, bisexual, but there's a lot of less common things, especially that have probably found that terms that are probably more, some of them are probably more recent terms even, because people have always felt certain ways that they didn't have words for. But I think this is useful for queer people. One, again, there were some things I didn't know, so you might still be getting better understanding of people who aren't who don't identify directly as you do, but also I think it's useful for people who haven't fully worked out. I think it's also useful for people who haven't worked everything out yet and might have been feeling some kind of way their whole life but haven't had a word for it, and you might read this and think, oh wow, that word actually really resonates with me, and that might be the validation that some people need. So I do think this is a really good read for those reasons. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually a comic anthology. So it's something that's very visually appealing. So we've got a bit of a mix of things on this list. And it's actually something that I backed on Kickstarter quite a number of years ago now. And it's Bella. And this is a comic anthology of reimagined fairy tales. And you've got a whole heap of different artists who worked on this for different stories. So you've got lots of beautiful art by different artists. And every story, and not only are they reimagined fairy tales, but they're fairy tales reimagined to have the focus on women, essentially. So you have these female-driven stories. And it's been many years since I've read this, so I can't 100% speak on all the representation within it, but I know that there's definitely sapphic love, and there's definitely some diverse representation in terms of race. Anything beyond that, I don't quite remember. There might be other things as well, but it's definitely beautiful. There definitely are queer stories within it, and so it's something I'm going to recommend. I think there is also a second volume now as well that I missed and I haven't read, but I think, yeah, there's another one out there. Next couple of things I'm going to talk about are things I've actually talked about fairly recently because I've read them both this year. They're both horror novels, but one is a YA and one is a adult book. And the first one, and the YA is Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. So this is a story where girls keep going missing. They're being brutally killed by something, and there's lots of creepy vibes, and you've got some beautiful friendships in this. And in terms of representation, I mean, this book's very queer. You've got a black asexual main character, so that the asexual representation's really beautiful to see because that's something that's definitely not that common in media. And you also have a sapphic relationship. Really nice story of friendship and female empowerment, but then you've also got all this kind of gruesome, creepy stuff going on because it is a horror. So very queer, really enjoyed it as a book overall, and yes. And for the adult one, it's The Luminous Dead by, I think it's Caitlin Starling, and this is a sci-fi horror set on a planet where people go deep diving down into caves to collect various resources and things like that, and they can be down there for months at a time. And it's a bit of a survivalist horror because you have this woman who has to go down there and shiz happens because it is a horror. But there is, again, a sapphic relationship in this. The thing about this is that this book is definitely completely focused on the horror. The relationship aspect is not a focus necessarily, but it exists. And so something I really appreciate about this book is that kind of the queerness just exists. Like, as important as stories are, as important as the stories of kind of queer people suffering and struggling are, because they're very real, it can be lovely to see, you know, queer people just existing as queer people without it being questioned, and it's just kind of there. And so that's kind of was the case in this book, but it was also a really interesting and creepy horror. Last thing I'm going to mention is a YA fantasy, but more like political fantasy, not like magic and stuff like that. But it's We Set the Dark on Fire by Taylor K. Magia. And in this society, basically men get two wives, or at least certain men do, and one of the women is expected to kind of take care of the business of the home and look after the household, and the other woman's supposed to be like the mother figure, the child bearer. So we're following these two young girls who have to marry this man, and there's also a lot of kind of political stuff going on in terms of people being very unhappy with the way this society works and wanting to kind of overthrow things. But in terms of representation, we do have, again, our sapphic love, because the two wives perhaps aren't that interested in their husband. Also, as an extra mention, I'm actually currently reading All Out, which is an anthology of queer stories, and it's a YA anthology of historical fiction. So each story is kind of set in a different time period, and this book is beautiful in its representation. Like, the whole point of this anthology is their queer stories throughout the ages, and so you've got all kinds of queerness in here, and our sapphic love and also, you know, gay representation and all the things. One of my favorite of the stories so far seemed to be like a Little Red Riding retelling, and it featured a trans boy, and that was a really interesting story. So there's lots of stuff in there. So I'm not loving all the stories, which can be a bit of a thing with an anthology, but regardless, there have been some really good ones in there, and the representation is beautiful. So that's my little extra mention. There's 6 books for you that feature queer representation of various kinds. And yes, let me know what are your favorite queer books, because actually other than the comic book anthology, they are all things I've read quite recently, which I suppose is why they're fresh in my mind to have wanted to talk about today. Let me know what are some of your favorite queer books out there, and I think that'll be it for today. Stay educated, stay safe, Starzy out.